Hello everyone, Zac Wilson, Hood County Chess Club here, and today I thought it might be kind of fun to analyze one of my own games and show you what it looks like when one amateur battles another in a chess tournament. This game was actually my very first game at a US chess tournament as part of the US Chess Federation. I came in as an unrated player since this was my first tournament game ever. This occurred just a few weeks ago over Labor Day weekend in 2020. And, I'm 47 years old and I've enjoyed chess the majority of my life, but I've never had the opportunity to play in an official tournament or try to earn a chess rating. So time to check things off the bucket list, as it were. And so kind of interesting going in the middle of a pandemic to an event where you're playing chess with a mask and a face covering, with the room socially distanced where only one game is occurring per 6-foot table and quite spaced out. What a unique situation for my very first tournament. This was at the 86th Southwest Open, held in Dallas, just outside of Dallas, Texas, in the Dallas-Fort Worth airport area. And my opponent was Michael Mao. What a great guy. Made a new friend. And if you're watching this, hi Michael. Glad you got to be my first opponent. And we're going to look and see how we did. Michael at this time is rated 1230. I'm unrated. And I know Michael's gone back and forth in his rating over the years, and he had just recently gotten back into participating in tournament level chess. So it's kind of fun to see where he's going to go and where I'm going to go in the process. I was fortunate enough to squeak out a win here. I can tell you that the tournament experience is quite exhilarating. Our time controls were 90 minutes plus 30 seconds per move. If you don't know what that means on the chess clock, each player has 90 minutes. Each time you make a move and you touch the clock, it adds 30 seconds back to your time. So if the game goes 30 moves, with each player adding 30 seconds per move, that could increase the total time by 30 minutes or more. I did have a game that went over 70 moves in this tournament. Thankfully, this game only went let's see here, it looks like 31 moves before we called it quits. And let's take a look at what we did here. I was very proud of Michael and I in the very beginning because our opening study really worked out well. I am a d4 player. I love opening with the queen's pawn. And Michael was prepared for this with an Indian style opening, knight f6, c4. If you know much about me, pretty much always d4 and c4 are my first two moves, regardless of what the opponent does. So let me see if I can kill learning the new software here with the colors. Okay. And so after which, there's a lot of ways that black could go here. He could go for some kind of King's Indian defense, maybe some kind of Nimzo Indian defense. He could attack immediately over here with c5. Going maybe towards a Tarrasch style defense or maybe a Banco gambit or something along those lines. But Michael here went for something more towards a Nimzo Indian or Queen's Indian. Knight to c3 gives him the option for either the traditional Nimzo move, bishop to b4, checking or pinning the knight. And I chose e3 here, going for what I thought would be called the Reshevsky variation. I guess the computer here is referring to it as the St. Petersburg or the Fischer variation. Simply, I'm getting ready to develop my knight. Instead of the traditional square of f3, I'm going for knight to e2. This is a pretty common idea where it's going to protect this other knight. A lot of other ideas in the Nimzo, you could do things like ignore it and allow black to capture, which would then double your pawns. You could do the slow, moving your queen over to queen c2 and make a lot of queen moves. I think that wastes a lot of tempo. So I really like knight to e2 because it's kind of unexpected. So fianchettoing the bishop is pretty standard here. A lot of times this bishop might actually come all the way out to a6, attacking the c4 square. You're going to see the knight to c6, knight to a5 maneuver also putting pressure on this square and really building against the c4 pawn, and that's what I was expecting to occur. So of course I get my knight here so that even though he's pinned, he's no longer going to force me to recapture with the pawn on B, doubling my pawns. I certainly don't want doubled pawns here, as that is a weakness in the endgame, and endgames are my strength, and so I was playing towards my strengths, wanting to keep my pawn structure intact. So he decided to fianchetto to b7, which I think is why they call it the Fischer variation or the St. Petersburg variation, because the Reshevsky actually has the bishop coming out here, like I had said before, attacking this pawn. Now this confused me because I wasn't expecting it. So it kind of surprised me, and it put pressure here, and I began to wonder, how am I going to develop this bishop and get castled without losing a pawn or putting this rook in danger? So I decided to put the question to his bishop immediately and get rid of the problem. And he could have chosen to retreat. I think half the people retreat, half the people capture. Michael chose to capture. As you can see here by the green arrow and the green star, the computer thinks this is an excellent move, right in there with the book. And I captured with the knight as planned. Here, the computer thinks he should have castled. Michael, I see what you're doing here. I think it's great having, a centralized knight defended by the bishop, putting pressure in my position already. But I do tend to agree with the computer of get castled early, especially if it's your first tournament. For me, it was my first. I know Michael's played before. But getting your king to safety is a great idea. I had another game in the same tournament where I didn't get my king to safety early enough, and it caused a lot of headache, and I wasted a lot of time on the clock having to calculate safety. You can see on the screen over here, on the side here, that the computer seems to think that in this game I played with a 97% accuracy, which really surprised me. Michael made a couple of mistakes, not that many. If you look here under inaccuracies, we each have one inaccuracy. Michael had what they consider 3 mistakes, but neither one of us had an obvious missed win, so I'll take that as a victory. Neither one of us had an obvious blunder. I think that's a huge victory for both of us. When the adrenaline's pumping and your brain is just really exhausted, keep in mind this game went about 3 hours in length, and you're just really focused and thinking for that length of time, knowing that you've got 2 more matches in the same day, and this was day 1 of a 3-day event. So the adrenaline's pumping and mistakes are going to occur. I would say that we were both very happy with this game in terms of the limited number of what the computer might consider to be errors here. So moving along, I went ahead and just got rid of this knight. It was bothering me some. I was worried about how am I going to get castled. So I was just trying to trade off pieces because the Nimzo Indian defense is a very aggressive, counter-attacking defense. And I was very nervous about giving my opponent an easy win right out of the opening. And I knew that my strength was endgames. So I felt that if I could just trade off some pieces and reduce the opportunities, that it would be easier for me to calculate and to calm down and to take deep breaths. And so that's a great example for you guys. Your first tournament, every time you make a move, even if you think you know what the instant reaction is, take a deep breath. I would do this on purpose. I would sit up in my chair. I would stretch my arms. I would breathe in through the nose, let it out through the mouth, and just relax for a moment. And I would allow myself, I gave myself permission. I would not make a move any faster than 5 minutes. I'd look at the clock and I would allow myself to think. And there were some moves I would take 10 minutes. If it was a critical position, 15 or 20 minutes would pass before I decided on my move. So he's got a centralized bishop here, and I really wasn't sure what to do. Again, I was really concerned about how I was going to develop this bishop and the weakness of this pawn and the attack that this bishop has x-raying my rook. So I made what I felt was a great move here. I simply moved my queen out, double attacking this bishop and this undefended g-pawn, seeing as how he hadn't castled yet. Now, he did have an easy response. When I say easy, I don't mean easy to find or easy to think of. I mean, you make one move to defend both threats. And that's simply putting your bishop to safety and blocking the access to that g-pawn. And of course, Michael being a great player, he found that pretty quickly. And you can see the computer agrees that really is the best move. So looking at this now, what I'm noticing is this rook is now exposed. If I could say anything about this position, even though we got there the way that we did, and they are all good moves because we're both attacking and counterattacking, I would say that his light squared bishop is now misplaced because it's not in its fianchettoed position, protecting this long diagonal, protecting this rook that could be easily attacked, and it's not over on a6 in its usual position, attacking the c4 pawn. So he's moved this bishop now, what, 1, 2, 3 times in the opening. And typical opening ideas are, if you can avoid it, only move each piece once, unless you have a really good reason to do so. Get all of your pieces developed. Get castled early. And so I would say that this is an area where this game doesn't really reflect that concept, and maybe that's something we'll get better at in our next game. So I moved my pawn here because I wanted to be able to fianchetto and put pressure on this long diagonal against this poor rook, and get my king castled, of course. Now, the book thinks that I should have just started to put pressure here and attacking this bishop, but I didn't. And he brings and develops his knight. Okay, if you're going to fianchetto, finish what you started. And he still hasn't castled yet. That did puzzle me a little bit. I thought, well, maybe he's worried about my queen being over here. Maybe he's concerned about any threats I could possibly make against the king side. Maybe he was considering leaving his king in the center. One thing he did note was that anytime in the, I don't want to say just the Nimzo-Indian opening, anytime that white moves the c4 pawn, this should be a big indicator to both sides that the c file is going to get opened up at some point, and you should fight for it. And I think Michael was very aware of this, and early on just tried to lay claim by putting his rook over here on c8. So I try to reposition my queen. I'm worried about leaving her out in the open. I just kind of wanted to consolidate my position since she wasn't really doing anything of value. He finally castles, even though we've been criticizing not castling early enough, and yet the computer is saying, yeah, that was an excellent move, but maybe moving the knight over here to a5 and attacking this c-pawn could have been better. I think it's really looking at this square here, which is now a weakness in white's position. I said before in some of my YouTube videos that many grandmasters that I've watched their videos will state things like amateurs look at pieces while grandmasters look at squares. And so what I think that means is not just material value, the willingness to sacrifice a piece, but instead of just looking where the pieces are at, it's looking at the pawn structure and the piece coordination and finding weaknesses like this square here and taking advantage of it. White no longer has a pawn defending this square, which means that this knight could have an incredible outpost, especially if he could drive this pawn up to a4 to give him defense, and he'd have just a ugly knight on the queen side, giving me all sorts of fits. So the computer saw that. Excuse me, that is my alarm on the phone. I apologize for that. I've got just a few minutes left here, and then we'll get off of this. So of course I finally get castled to safety. I'm thinking this is fantastic. I was really getting concerned about that. Attacking the center is good, but again, you can see the computer wanting to reposition that knight. I was preparing this move. He goes ahead and says, you know what? This bishop really isn't looking at much of anything, really isn't doing much. This is my strong defensive bishop. Anytime you see somebody fianchettoed, you want to get rid of that defensive bishop. So that's what he does. And I just go ahead and disrupt the pawn structure, giving him doubled pawns on the same file, and getting ready to open up with either of these pawn pushes. So just repositioning my bishop into the king's position so that after this pawn moves, I've got a monster bishop attacking down the long diagonal. He gets ready to make some attacks. He's pinning my king, and you can see that the computer wanted this pawn to move. Well, he's preparing that pawn movement as well as rook attacks down the f-file with this pin. So I start attacking on the queen side because I figure, well, my pawn structure is pointing to the queen side, so I should attack that direction. Here comes the f-pawn movement, which is great attacking down the f-file, but it does open up some weak squares by moving the f-pawn, so I take advantage of that. Ejecting this knight, great place for the knight, And here I just wanted to get some movement. I wanted to get my rooks in behind my pawns and start pushing. I wanted to move this rook over and start just opening up the position. Even though the computer says that it likes the queen going to c4, I had intended to wait on that move. So this is one of the mistakes the computer didn't like. You know, I said earlier in the beginning of the game, he did a great job of putting that rook on the c file. It would have been much better for him to move the opposite rook over here to contest on the d file. So I think having the rooks on c and d would have been much better. I think the computer agrees. And so that was just a miscalculation there, and it happens to all of us. This queen move is about setting up an X-ray attack. Of course, Michael is an amazing chess player. He sees it immediately and gets his king off of the discovered check. Now, this move I was worried about. I had been worried about the f-pawn coming because this pawn is pinned. I've been trying to keep this square open so that my bishop can come and attack the queen and support this pawn if necessary. But I was trying to build up some pressure with my rook, and I closed that off. And I think Michael was thinking the same thing as I was. And maybe he and I both didn't calculate it far enough. But he saw the opportunity and jumped on it with f, and the f-pawn moving forward. And I was a little disconcerted by this. I thought, well, golly, I took away my opportunity here and he seized it. But it turns out to be an inaccuracy, which I suppose is just lucky for me. I took here and I expected him to take with his rook because I'm pinned. And that's why I wanted this bishop to be able to come here, because I calculated I'd be able to pin the rook to the queen. And now that opportunity is not there. And of course, Michael saw this and took advantage of it. The reason the computer finds this to be an inaccuracy was after I spent, I don't know how much time, it felt like 15, maybe even 20 minutes, I finally found the move that I wanted, and it turns out that it's the move the computer wanted me to make. The queen capturing this undefended pawn. See, I figured if he took this pawn, the f-pawn, I'd take the c-pawn and it would be balanced, but it's even stronger than that. So let's take a look at this move. What am I threatening? I'm threatening to capture the rook, and then if queen takes, and so I'm up a rook. I'm also threatening this undefended rook, which, by the way, gives me a back rank mate situation against the king. I'm also threatening, through an X-ray, this key square that is being attacked by the queen and the bishop. And so depending on what black does here, it could all fall apart very, very quickly. So Michael took a very long think on this one. I think he looked at every variation. I saw him smile. I saw him sit back and raise his eyebrows. I saw him shake his head. I think both of us were thinking the same thing, that this was the critical move of the game, that this was the deciding move of the game, and that there really wasn't much of a way out. I encourage you to pause the video here and figure out what you would do as black and evaluate all the different opportunities. You have to calculate, what would you do, what would I do, or what would he do? How does it go if black saves the rook by moving here? What would we do if the knight were to capture here and have an interesting fork against my queen and bishop? What would you do if you simply moved this rook back to protect the back rank? There are just so many different opportunities here, and I will tell you that there are so many ways that black could go wrong. Michael, I think, put forth the best effort. I would have made this move. The computer thinks he should have made this move. Either way, it ends in losing an exchange. And so it allows me to take here. Then he takes here. So the exchange is he gets a bishop, I get a rook. The queens come off the board. And then look at this. I have a rook behind a passed pawn that's coming to promote. I have another rook threatening an undefended pawn that's isolated, that has an undefended knight that's behind it. His king is in the corner. And more importantly, if you look at this pawn and draw the square of the pawn for where it's going to promote, you can see that the king is outside the square of the pawn. This is an endgame thing. That's why I did what I did, just trying to get to the end game. I need to get better at middle game tactics, and I recognize that. So he moves his king, trying to get into the square. So I make the square smaller. You can see that the square of the pawn, the king is outside of it still and threatening his knight, so he has to maneuver the knight, which allows me to shrink that square even further. And now the king is far outside the square. So he stops the pawn from coming in. Well, the pawn was already stopped. If I try to queen, he's just going to take, and I'm going to trade pawn for knight. There's no way there's going to be a queen, although he doesn't want to trade his knight for that pawn. So he blocks it instead. The problem with that is it allows me to capture here, which prevents this king from ever, doesn't matter where he goes, he will never be able to cross this line. He cannot lend aid to that pawn that's going to promote. Even though he tries to get closer, it doesn't matter. Now I'm double attacking. You see this square here? I can attack it with this rook. I can attack through the pawn with this rook. I believe this queen is coming. Michael agreed, shook hands, and resigned the game. Okay, well, I hope that was interesting for you. I do want to say that I really like Chess.com's analysis software. You can see this graph over here where it shows who it thought had the advantage. It showed that I had a very slight advantage, and then I threw it away. And then I regained a slight advantage, and then I threw it away again. And then I got a slight advantage, and I threw it away again, and then just a huge advantage. And I think this is the way that most games will go. If I were to analyze the rest of my games, whether I won or lost, I think you would see one side maybe go back and forth fighting for a slight advantage most of the game until one person makes a critical mistake. It is kind of fun to go through here and see the analysis. You can make the moves, and you can see the little white book there says this is the book move. These are moves that have been written down and studied over the test of time. And then you can see no more book move, but it is excellent. And as you move through, you can see we're making the best moves until here, and it shows you, oh, knight to e4 was an excellent move, but castling was better. And it will give you variations of why it believes that it is better. And so it's fun to go through and really kind of see how many green best moves you can get. I was really impressed by Michael and I on how many times we had green and blue, which is great, excellent, and or best. And you'll notice that there was only a couple times where he felt that that was just a good move and that the knight move was the better one. And so you can go back and analyze your game and look and see what idea you missed, see why you should have considered a different move. I think here Michael will discover that he really should have moved the opposite rook there, and he'll play differently in the next game. And I was very proud to find this move here. Without that move, this rook really is a pretty good idea with this pin here. It only failed to one move, and I was very blessed to find it. And the game just continues from there. You can see a lot of greens and blues, and there we go. So I hope you find that fascinating. Get a membership to chess.com where you can input your games and analyze your games. I want to thank Michael Mal for being such an incredible opponent. I'm very grateful that he was the first person that I got to play in my first official tournament game because we had such a great time, and he was quite the gentleman. Well, until next time, please visit our Facebook page at Hood County Chess Club. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the like button to help us share our videos with others who are looking for fun stuff. I'm Zac Wilson with Hood County Chess Club. We'll see you real soon.